recap to find out where everybody is on their thesis, and then we're going to divide them to the Kant teams, time versus space teams, which is unfortunate, but anyway. Lauren? Okay, can you say your name?
Yes, I'm Lauren. I've been trying to find a piece of writing on Leibniz.
On Leibniz. Okay, that's good. That's good.
Stuart, I'm pulling together sort of work for the final show for my MA, really, for a month's time, I think the deadline is. So yeah, a lot of it about this building, and also thinking frantically about the conference and the paper that I
Foolishly put forward.
Yes.
Yes, well done. What's the name of the paper?
Well, it's got a working title. I think Edward Richard Taylor's Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which obviously just a rip off of all concretes, and that's kind of what it is. Edward Richard Taylor was the headmaster of this great institution from 1877 to 1903.
That's a long time.
Yeah, he only retired then because he had to. It's council policy.
Wow.
Retire at 60, 65.
Wow, unbelievable.
Yeah,
Huh.
he dabbled in. He experimented with, well, he sort of, yeah, ceramics. So yes, I forgot to say it was his Exploding Plastic Inevitable minus sex and drugs and rock and roll. It hasn't got any of that, but it's got some amazing glaze effects.
Well done.
Yeah.
Okay. Good, okay.
Hi, I'm Joan, and I came in October last time. I'm just started my PhD, and I've just handed in my research and methodologies thingy. And so I'm just trying to read more now after tunneling myself through that.
Good,
Trying to go wider again now.
good, excellent.
I'm Kate, postdoc, and this morning I sent off a revised article for a journal in France, which is teetering on the balance of one peer reviewer liked it and the other one hated it. So I've revised it massively.
And then now the first one I hate it, and the next one.
The third one. It's going to be sent for the third one. So, and I'm about to start working on my paper for at the Sorbonne. There's a conference on performance philosophy in exactly when you're having your conference, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Can't have anything to do with what you're doing, but I'm going to try and talk a bit about it when we talk about Kant and space today.
Okay, good.
Oh, I'm Sophie. I'm just doing my, like Stuart, getting ready for the end final show. So I'm doing a series of films and trying out projecting them onto different surfaces and seeing the effect that has. I'm thinking of building two spaces basically divided up space. So I'm looking at time and space ironically quite a lot, reading a lot around that. So the Kant's good. I've been reading Space and Sexuality, which is Princeton architecture, and that's really interesting. There's lots of different essays and sort of artworks to do that. So yeah,
Good.
I'm Andre, and also again, like Stuart, I'm a little bit enthused about putting in forward a paper and work and being accepted onto it. So now I've got to produce a paper and work. I've made work before. I've never done a paper, so this is going to be a new one for me. So maybe we can chat about that tomorrow.
He says hopefully.
Yeah, just putting it out there.
That's right. No.
No.
No, we can't because I'm actually on annual leave tomorrow.
Okay.
Sorry. If you come down to London, we could talk.
I'm down in Saturday.
Yeah, that's not impossible, but I have to be in London.
No.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I'm Oscar, and now I'm working between two projects, ongoing projects. One related with identity and regarding how the place you live makes you different, kind of things. And another regarding prestige in digital era and how format changed your perception of pieces of art.
Oh, that's interesting. And where are you doing that for? Is it just your own projects? Are you presenting it anywhere? Or?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I don't work like that. I work
Okay.
like, I feel like some idea is interesting and then I figure out where to apply or where this project fits.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah.
I'm Dane. At the moment I'm filming the robots. I'm walking around in the dark filming things. I'm working on paper for the conference at the moment. The working title is Generating the Life Impulse, the Artist, Alchemist, Artificer's Task from Magnus Lametri, the Abstract Machine and the Solid State.
Wow. What does a robot look like?
It's bits and pieces at the moment. It has some
I mean, will it
appendages.
look like this, or will it look like a human figure, or will it look like a
It will
bug?
perhaps have human features combined with a sort of an industrial, messy assembly look, all put together like a weird sort of Frankensteinish creation, full of
Okay.
baroque wiring and strange curves and stuff.
And is there a reason for that, other than you just like that look? Like, is there like a geometric or a mathematical reason it has to have that kind of?
I think
Good.
I like it.
I just like it. Good.
My name is Mattia. I'm also walking around in the dark, metaphorically. I just realized that the PhD will have an end soon, and I'm running after that.
Okay, so you're having a small but not insignificant nervous breakdown.
And I am also preparing an article for the conference, which instead is a bit more clear and plays with the idea. It's an experiment in itself. The title is The Power of Two, Squaring the System, Feedback Loops, and the Very Fact That. And I'm trying to put forward that multiplying something by itself and some artistic actions, as in the famous Duchamp fountain, are actually working along the same logic, where by the very fact of doing something, everything changes, although nothing is added to it, or in a more empirical way.
Great. Thanks. Samira? That's it.
At the moment, confused with the cat.
You're confused with the cat. There's a very interesting artist that has been showing. She's from Russia, but I'm not sure where. I'm not sure what the language is. Anyway, her mother passed away a couple of years ago. She got very, very depressed, and she had this really large cat, a very fat cat. And so she decided, her friends told her that, why don't you just do something with your cat then, it makes you happy. And so she started redoing all the originals, putting a big cat in there.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm.
It's great. I mean, it's completely nutty. But I think it works. Do you think it works?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, some of the Titans one is like fantastic.
It's an enormous fat cat.
Yeah, it's an enormous
It
fat
kind of
cat.
sits in the middle of
Of like these mad paintings, you know. So I mean, I think the one with the Mona Lisa taking a selfie
yeah.
was pretty good with her cat. You know, it's just very clever. Anyway, yeah.
I'm Jakub, and I have a few things going on. So I'm preparing for exhibition, and it's the day before conference.
Perfect.
Not busy enough. That I think I'm just doing it because I'm foreign, which is weird. I think that's the only reason that my work was chosen. But anyway. And second of all, I'm working on.
What makes you say that?
The whole idea of the exhibition is that it's
Insider, outsider?
yeah, kind of thing. But it doesn't really have any concept to it, and I'm kind of struggling with that. But anyway, that's fine. I need to show something, so I feel like I need to show something at this time. Other than that, I'm working on Fatima, which is the project for a conference. I'm not sure if it's she. Anyway, Fatima is going to make her first appearance during conference. Fatima is also an ongoing project for my PhD, as she's going to be part of writing team of my thesis. Hopefully, if that happens, it feels like there are certain things that I would not say but need to be said.
We need to discuss this.
Yeah.
Because the one thing I would just strongly advise anyone is that try not to be overly experimental with the frame of the thesis.
Oh no, it's not as much experimental. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
In a sense, like, it's
gonna-
not like a collaborative event between you and Fatima. I would be very careful because
No.
externals might not find it quite as,
No, I think she's just gonna be more part of the practical elements to it.
just be careful.
Yeah.
Just be careful with that, because I have unfortunately seen many, many theses fall on their swords, as it were, when you've got a lot on your plate just to get it out. And a lot of times one tries to be very creative because you can't figure out what to say, or you can't figure out how to say it. And so a creative move happens, and then when that happens, it often destroys the actual argument. So one thesis that happened, this happened with somebody that did a thesis on wounds and decided that the thesis itself should be wounded, which it was, and didn't pass. And so you have to be really, really careful about that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, I know, but I'm yeah.
Just
I
to
need
make you very relaxed and
Yeah.
feel
No,
better
I
about
need to
things.
figure out her place in it, but I think again, I don't want to call her. Other than that, I'm working on. I'm right now researching this cryptio inferior and its inability to disappear, which is quite interesting. So I start writing and playing with the text and light, writing on a see-through paper and reflecting actually things through it and seeing it over the light. Tracing paper, when you put it over the light, it reveals, and it comes from. I kind of try to put it through. In the queer book, I found a quote that from Invisible Man, and it says, "Without a light, I'm not only invisible but also formless." And that quote itself kind of got me quite interesting and working, actual practical work put into it. And other than that, what else I did?
Do you know the work of Pierre Molyneux?
No.
So Pierre Molyneux, you really should know the work of. I loaned Pierre Molyneux's work up to somebody.
There is a booklet.
It was here, but
Yeah.
I've loaned it to somebody, and I don't know what's happened to it. It's a purple book with a very nondescript cover. In fact, I don't even think it has anything on the cover. Pierre Molie, Moliniere, and Molieniere. He got thrown out of the Surrealist group because his work was considered too audacious, which I think is fantastic, and blasphemous. His work is incredibly blasphemous. But the reason I mentioned him is because he had a whole thing on fetish. And the question on, apart from the fact his work is fetishistic, but it was about the fact that things could not have an appearance, that the minute you shine the light on it, it dissolved. So it's kind of the opposite. It's another way into the same kind of, I think, the same kind of question. This way in which, and Foucault also talks about the question of fetish not being able to survive shining a light on it, and that's a very important, talisman or map key, a key to a map to figure out how power regimes get established. I have an article on that, which you can look on academia.edu, called I forgot what it was called, something like Foucault's Ethical Demand. It's all about how fetish, it explains that argument, but anyway. Grace?
Yeah, I'm working towards a solo show of all my PhD artwork, which opens on the 24th of June.
Oh, that's perfect.
Hopefully everyone can go. Also working on the conference, my paper's title is Vanishing in Plain Sight, and it's in collaboration with David Cheeseman. So it's kind of performative as well.
Are you going to be able to give it while being sawn in half?
We're
Or is
going
it-
to test it.
Yeah.
Because we're not entirely sure. If not, it will be a performance and then a shorter paper, so it'll still fit within the time.
Yeah, no.
Yes, that's.
Well, you have
about
40 minutes, as a keynote.
Yeah.
Okay. And you need to hold your breath for how long? 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yes, Lee, and at the moment, really, what I've got in my head is the redesign of the thesis, which I'm working on at the moment. And
Do you want to give anybody any clues?
Well, only that it's changing. It's changing to the point where it's not going to be recognisable from what the previous edition. So it's going to change format. The content's going to change in the sense that it's going to be much more visual. We're going to be inviting, hopefully, artists to be included as well as just having papers. And the whole thing's going to be much more, hopefully, kind of tactile and interesting, and we're going to be hopefully asking at least one of the artists to contribute to the front of it, so to make it much more an object of research and an art object in itself.
Good, great, thanks.
Hi, Mark. Munching through the classical canon, I believe. We did the Leibniz, we did the Kant. I see a summer of Hegel and Heidegger. It's like wonderful. So, yeah, that's
Great.
what I'm up to.
Yeah, it's nice. Okay, everybody happy? Let's go. I was worried last week, and not just last week, but I've been worried about this move into the classical canon that we've been doing. I think it's very instructive on the one hand, but I do tend to, I think that my fear has been that I haven't been giving lectures here. Normally, like last semester, or when we were doing Heidegger and Hegel, I gave a couple lectures, and that kind of set you on your path a bit. I decided not to do it this time, and I'm not sure how much you have had to then struggle to deal with this text, and if the struggle's been worth it. So today is a bit of an experiment to see if, not so much if you've got it right, because God knows there's zillions of ways to interpret Kant, but if it worked for you, because there's a lot of pressure on you, as Mattia was just saying, to finish, or to get started, or to be in the middle of it, and you do need a couple markers along the way. So I don't want this seminar to be taken as something that you just have to come to because, oh, it's here, but that it's actively doing something for you. And if the lecture side of it is more helpful, great. If this is more helpful, great, or if there's some combination. So that's the, for me, that's the pedagogical takeaway I want to have from today's day. But I also would like to see what you can come up with. So we decided to divide into two kind of, not teams, but let's say, very American here, two teams, the time team and the space team. Who wants to begin? Does anybody remember the teams? Who's on the teams? What team are you on?
Time.
I think we brought you into a team.
I'll be time, it's fine.
You can be time. Yes, Lee?
I think I was space.
You were space, yeah.
Both space and time.
You were space and time.
Space.
See, this is the overworking moment. Okay, but that's all right, it's good. Yeah. Oh, you were, yeah. Well, you were sick.
Time.
You were time.
I was space, but then it turned out to be a trick question because separating time and space is not possible. So,
well, it is not
Time bank.
it's not impossible completely. But okay, but you basically came at it through the space.
my
Lens.
piece of work that I'm looking at makes time work spatially and space work temporally.
Well done. Joe wasn't here. Stuart?
No space.
Okay. So, who wants to be the first, throw out the first salvo? Kate?
Can I bring an image up
Of course.
on the screen? It just needs to go onto Google and then I can give it a...
Well, our screen is a little bit compromised at the moment.
Is it?
Well, it had an accident. So it kind of isn't working as well, but I don't know if it can actually, it may not work very well, but it might. What's that? Oh, okay, while we're setting that up then, if you, what is the screen?
It's http://
Okay, while you're thinking of this image, Sophie?
Okay. Well, for me when I was reading it and making it, came across was time being subjective.
Okay. And what's it subjective? What does it mean to say that?
That basically it's your experience. It's basically your own experience of time. That time is intuitive. That time is not. Well, he says time is not an object. And then the most interesting bit for me was where he says time, therefore, is not to be regarded as an object, but as the matter of representation of myself as an object.
Okay, so that doesn't necessarily mean it's subjective. That just means it's conceivably, well, we can hang in with that. Go on, defend yourself.
It's not necessarily subjective. It's more.
And where does it say what you're saying? Remember where?
Well, that bit is in 8, elucidation.
Okay. Does everybody have that?
He says, time no doubt is something real. That is, it is the real form of our internal intuition. It therefore has subjective reality. In reference to our internal experience, that is. I have really the representation of time and of my determinations therein.
Okay, let's stay with that just for a second. That's a very good selection.
So is that the first sentence of the elucidation?
No, it's like
Just
the.
before B34.
I grant the whole argument, he says, and then he's talking about change.
Sorry, what page?
Changes are only possible in time, and therefore time must be something real. Well, in mine it's 53, but I'm not sure if it's.
And yours is, what's the translator?
It's off the Dropbox.
So that's going to be the Kemp Smith, is it?
I'm not sure if it's.
It is B54, yeah.
It's number 8, elucidation of the time part of the time section.
79 on the
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, okay, good. Say it again, sorry.
Okay, so, well, should I go back from the changes are real, or?
Well, I think that it's important here, whereas this time is therefore to be regarded as real, not indeed as object, but as the mode of representation of myself as object. That's what you're looking at, right? Okay. So let's start. Let me start with this. If I say it's 2 o'clock, is that, or let's say at this point 2:30, is that a subjective view? Is that just my view of things? No. So what type of time allows me to make that kind of claim? Or to put it slightly differently, what type of time allows one to say it's subjective? If we just say it's everybody look at your watch, it's 2:30, everybody like does their watch at 2:30. How is that different than the kind of time he's talking about here?
Because it's a convention.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just the convention, so we've all agreed.
It's a construct, isn't it? It's been
Yeah.
decided, but.
It's an empirical time, measurable time.
It's a measurable thing, this thing. So why is that not considered objective? Why is he's pushing a point about this? He's saying, even if I say it's 2:32 now, we all can see it's 2:32. How is that how does that help us to understand how to dislodge that 2:32 from the concept of the object? What other materiality is being put forward here? Okay, to put it again a different way, the word object implies a 3D entity that exists in an unchangeable fashion, in a universal fashion. You can push that further and say, well, it doesn't have to be 3D, but it has to be something that's true in every case. Now, time can fit into that comment in the sense of 2:30 in the afternoon. It was 2:30, blah, 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 and you can get a sense of time. Why is it that is both a materiality, or how is it that it's both materiality and yet not this objective form. How is it that it
Singularity.
yes, but what do we mean by singularity then? And what does Kant mean by singularity?
That you cannot, you have to define it, you have to define the object inside the object. Just choose a frame or a part of it. You cannot never.
So you're
capture it.
suggesting that in order to make time make sense, the frame is experience, which is that part you were talking about. The frame of this thing would be experience, and that inside this frame called experience, you'd have this moment of temporality. Sure?
Yes.
That good?
The time, the 2:33, let's say. It's time we perceive only now. But there is time more all the time, isn't it? It doesn't have to be this time, but that's this time we understand and we see.
So if it's 2:33, we can say 2:33, and we all know what 2:33 means.
But that's because of experience of time. That's why that's what makes it object.
So you have to experience
Time.
2:33 in order to understand that it's 2:33.
No.
Okay.
Is it a representation of
Okay, close.
the time?
It's to do with it being intuitive, isn't it? Time.
Okay, what do you mean by intuitive?
Well, but it
Or what does Kant mean by
Well,
intuitive?
he talks a lot about time being related to intuition, where space isn't. I think because he's not talking about necessarily present time, so it's not just one time.
That's right. Yeah, the moment.
Yeah.
But okay, let's start it in a different way. What does time-based media mean? There are people in this room that are working in time-based media. You can all hide now if you don't want to be recognized. But what does it mean to say time-based media? Just in a general sense, in a sense of today's industry. Like if you put in your CV, I'm working in time-based media. What would that mean?
Film or animation.
Yeah, and why would that be time-based? What is it that?
Because you're adding an extra dimension to it.
How is it that it's based in time? What does that mean to say that it?
Is it because then you can't grasp the whole thing in some immediate way? So, you need duration.
Yes, time gives the ground to the whole thing.
Yes, okay, good, now here we are. Okay, now we're back on the thing. So where time-based media means that in order for you to go in and make some sort of sense of it, what's pulling it all together is the material ground called time. And that and that doesn't necessarily have 3D or 1D or 2, because time-based media, film, for example, the way in which that operates, you can only operate it through the mechanism of some form of timing that's going on. Hence, painting is not normally considered a time-based medium, even though obviously you can say that it's time-based. So your work, for example, Jakob, is absolutely, most of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is situated through this lens of time. Now, let's say we have a lens of time. Let's just use that as an expression just for the sake of it being here. What does that mean to say that you're able to ground, we spent last semester on the notion of bloody groundless grounds, right? And then the monads and so on and so on. So what does it mean to say that something gets located or grounded, these kind of spatial metaphors, in something that is not spatial? What does it mean to say that? Because that's a very important quote that you picked up. So what's being pulled out here? What does it mean to say that in order to understand, in order to access, in order to make sense of something, time becomes your magic carpet that you ride into it? Yeah, Mark. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I think as Kay said, you can use time basis. Basis is the important figure in Kant, I think. And to add two concepts of judgments of perception, just which compare and contrast, you'd have to add the categories and understand to them to make the objectivity that he looks for. But as Jack was saying, or no, as Oscar was saying, it's that the concept within a concept. So your question about 230, you really have to go right back to the spheres, the planets and the sun, and then you'd start to get into mathematical that Kant talks about as the objective, quantifying, qualitative relation, permanent substance that he would want to find at the root of this. There's a kind of what I call ball again geometry. In his case, it's a Euclidean geometry. You have to put charts out and measure. That would then start to get into the conventions that we also talked around language.
Okay, I'm going to try it this way. Okay, it just made me think of Garcia Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, and he is a very famous poem called 5 in the Afternoon, and it's about fascism coming into Spain, but it's also about the suicide of his lover. So, and I'm just going to read you the first couple of stanzas so you get a sense of how he's using this. Cojita and death. At 5 in the afternoon, it was exactly 5 in the afternoon. A boy brought the white sheet at 5 in the afternoon. A frail of lime ready prepared at 5 in the afternoon. The rest was death, and death alone. And it goes on. At 5 in the afternoon, the bulls ran through the town. At 5 in the afternoon, blah, blah, blah. And he talks about the fascists coming in at 5. Why 5? What is it about 5 that sets the scene, that grounds it?
Because it's a common point.
But why 5? Why not like at 1 o'clock in the morning? At 5 in the afternoon, it's repeating it. There's something about, rather than calling it grounding, let's call it setting the scene. How does time set the scene for you to then move in? What happens at 5 o'clock in the afternoon?
I think it's the bullfighting party at 5.
Yeah.
When it starts.
It's when it starts. It's when the madness begins, the bloodletting begins.
When the bulls come into the legs.
And then he's saying that's when the fascist boots come in. That's when Europe changed. That's when it turned right wing. He's saying at 5 in the afternoon. And so, obviously he's putting this in a poet's lament way, but he's grounding it in the spatial moment called 5 in the afternoon. So Kant is beginning to situate, how does one understand this thing called 5 in the afternoon? Now, do you have your picture? Can you type it into?
HTTP.
Oh, okay. Yeah. HTTP.
:// TTP. Sorry, TPP.
TPP.
2014.com.
2014.com.
/EN-US. /. That's it. And if you scroll down, we'll come to the picture.
To where? To this picture?
Yes, no, there's a picture in yellow that will kind of strike you when you see it.
Hasn't happened.
Oh, you've got to go into workshops, sorry.
Ah. Okay. Conference, workshops.
And scroll down. Okay, that's it. That's my image.
Okay.
actually enormous.
Hold on, see someone, if I can get it. Wow, it's really not enormous. Okay, that's very tiny. Yeah. Let's see if we can get that bigger. There we go.
Ah,
Okay. Trying to get it to the other screen. Can everybody see that? Can't seem to move to the screen. Okay. Anyway.
what I wanted to do is to do a sort of flip chart in.
Okay, that may prove to be difficult, that particular flip chart.
Flip chart time.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a bit reductive. I hope it doesn't offend you by being reductive, but space, time, space, in, out, time, back, forth. These are Kant's definitions. Three-dimensional, one-dimensional, objective, subjective, outer, inner, shape and position. So I teach a module on ancient Greek drama, and in ancient Greek drama they have a thing called the ekiklema, which is like a little low trolley. And after Clytemnestra has murdered Agamemnon in revenge for this and that he's done, she seduces him inside the palace, which on the ancient Greek stage was behind the skene, or a wooden screen. And we know she's going to kill him, and Cassandra knows she's going to kill him, but he doesn't know she's going to kill him. And he goes into the palace to be killed, and we don't see him be killed, but we hear his death cry. And then immediately afterwards, the Greeks needed a way of bringing the inside out, making the private public. So the palace doors burst open, and this little low trolley comes out with Cassandra kind of standing over the body of Agamemnon, and Clytemnestra standing over the body of Cassandra, and Agamemnon, her husband, who she's just murdered, knifed, and it's very bloody. And the lines that she says, "I stand where I struck," kind of tell you that she's still inside the palace, except thanks to the little low trolley, she's come outside the palace and we can see her. And I think that the ekiklema radicalizes the relationship between time and space, because it makes, it does something with this in, out, back, forth trajectory. So although we can't see the murder because it's happening inside the palace, it's brought out by this sort of magic, sort of surreal strategy. And the same thing's going on in this image, I think.
Get rid of that. I'll put that over to the screen.
How do you do that?
So just click on the side of it.
This is the image of Robert, who's a 14-year-old boy, in a play that Edward Bond wrote for Big Brum Theatre and Education Company, which works in Birmingham. And Robert's a 14-year-old boy, and we never see him. He's a troubled teen, so he's always shut in his room. We don't see him, we don't see him, we don't see him. We see his mother and her boyfriend discussing what a pain he is, how difficult he is. We just hear him spoken about. So he doesn't have shape or position, and he doesn't exist in the outer three-dimensional world. He just exists in this sort of inner subjective sort of temporal realm. Meanwhile, the mother's boyfriend is sort of setting him up as a vandal so that he can kick him out and get his hands on the mother's money, and then she'll be hugely humiliated. But this involves lying to the mother. But Robert has got a little peephole through the wall so he can see what's going on. So he's on to the boyfriend, he's on to Vernon. And Vernon has smashed his own car window and he's trying to blame Robert. And at this stage in the auditorium, we believe them. We think that Robert's done it. You know, we think, because they say he's a teen vandal. And Robert, sort of behind the wall, is getting so enraged and angry that he comes through the wall. And it's very peculiar because you think the wall is a wall. It's designed to look like a wall. I don't know why in that production, that was the French production, they made it out of yellow cloth. Which is slightly peculiar, but I like the image because it's sort of a dynamic image. But you sort of start to see his shape coming through the wall. You see his face and his nose kind of pressing through the wall. And it's really an odd moment in the theatre because it's a surreal moment. Edward Bond's plays are usually considered sort of literary, language-based, figurative. You know, it's very hard for drama not to be figurative. But I think this is a moment when it stops being figurative and it starts to be more, what do you call it in the art world, conceptual. Because as Robert comes out, we see him, but we only see his outline kind of draped in this piece of material. He still doesn't really have a shape or a position or a figure. And it sort of expresses his immense anger and fury at the injustice. And we only learn in the audience that he's being fitted up sort of subsequent to this. But very soon after this, Vernon gets a piece of glass and cuts Robert's hand through the material to make him look guilty for, you know, smashing glass. And then we realise, so we have this kind of odd experience which doesn't sort of fit anywhere.
So their experience also doesn't belong just to time or just to space as well. So it also is a movable feast.
Yeah.
This thing called experience.
Yeah.
Good.
So the inner is sort of manifested in the outer. So it radicalises the relationship between these two things in a really peculiar and productive way.
I think that's a very useful way to begin this conversation. My concern is that because you set up a binary, of course we've already set up the binary, space and time, it allows one to sort of reject the binary, but at the same time use it in order to forward something else. So the difficulty here is that the so-called conceit is that the space is then seen as out and in, and time is back and forth. But maybe time could be out and in, out of time, out of joint. This is the Derridian move, of course. You know, or the space could be back and forth as well. So what happens when those two defined environments start to shapeshift?
Well, I think then you get sort of radical art, but not when they're binaries, perhaps.
Okay, well I think that's a really good way to start the discussion. Do people have comments on that then? Did that help? Mathieu?
I believe we are missing the point. Not with this, but from when
Just ignore that, Dave.
what we discussed until now. The point that Kant makes about space and time, because what he's doing with these two notions is what then becomes known as the Kantian revolution. He's turning them inside out, and rather than saying that space and time are something or something else, he's saying that space and time are the form with which we perceive reality, which is radically different. Then this works. Space is outside, the perception of the outside is about 3D, time is the inner perception. But without that, it seems we're still dealing with the same thing everybody else dealt with before, which is we are actually reaching reality, we can tell, we'll say what it is, we can know it, and everybody goes home happy. Instead, the problem is pointing out that that's not possible, and we always only know the reality we've packaged through the senses we have. And space and time are the sensitive ones, and then there are one category is higher up.
So how would you then come at the Kantian notion of time?
It doesn't really. In the second part of the transcendental aesthetics, when it first is dispelling the possible criticism of being idealist, and then he goes deeper, and he starts saying that we perceive time as space and space through time.
So sorry, does everybody know what is being dismissed when Matthias says Kant dismisses the idealism position on time? Do you know what that is? Can you just summarize that very quickly?
Because the problem he's trying to solve is to bring together, find a solution between the opposite poles of empiricism and rationalism. Empiricism posing that everything that is in the mind comes from the senses, and rationalism instead proposing that the mind has some innate ideas that work a priori of anything else, and they are already there when we exist. And the two are two sides of the same field that can never be combined or are constantly opposed, because they it's like saying, well, what comes first, the egg or the chicken? It can constantly be one after the other. And he tries to find a solution that brings these two things together and can find, especially to the Humean skepticism of not finding a reason for things to be how they are. Since things obviously are, if causality exists in the world, Hume is not in doubt in that, but you cannot find a necessary reason for causality to exist, therefore causality could cease existing. And Kant goes after that problem, and for the part of the aesthetics, the senses, says instead of having the Newtonian move that posits space and time as absolute, like a stage on which everything else takes place, Kant says we are actually having the intuition of space and time as forms that organize the data the raw data that the senses bring in. And once they have packaged that data, then that object, which in German is called appearance, but is always translated as phenomenon, because appearance seems too vague. So phenomenon is really what comes to the possibility of the senses. That is objective, that's certain, that's real knowledge. That is not knowledge of the thing itself, it is knowledge of how we can know the thing itself.
So let's just back up, so I want to make sure that everyone gets this. And I'm going to try it slightly differently. If you did not have your computer, would you be able to see what's on the screen on your computer? If you did not have a computer, would you be able to read computer art? Would you be able to see computer art? This is not a trick question. No. Yes. Okay. So you need something, in this case called the computer, to be able to read or to see or to somehow make sense of this entity that we so nonchalantly see as something on our screen, which any 4-year-old now understands as just given. It is conceivable, though this is a bit of a stretch, but I want to try and get you to think in this way, that intuition is the hardware, not the software. Intuition is the computer. Up to now, people think of intuition as the soft option, around which one perceives this and that, so it's an opinion, as it were. It's my intuition or your intuition. But he's using intuition the same way one could use the computer. It is your hardware, it's your format that allows one to have something emerge so that it's seeable, and without that format, you're not gonna see it, period. So it's not that there's some sort of inner perception or outer thought process, it's literally the formatting. And that formatting itself doesn't have a shape to it. So it's not called a computer, it's called intuition. It doesn't have a body. It operates as though it had a body because it operates as law. It operates as a form of that which is certain.
It's a fact.
It operates as a fact. It's not a fact, but it operates as a fact.
Or we perceive that as a fact.
But when you say perceive, this is why I used to ban the word perception. For those of you that have been with me for years and years, you know that perception's only recently come into the use here. Perception is not an opinion. Perception is your hardware that allows you or not to see what is standing in front of you. That doesn't mean that it isn't or is, you know, that if you're not standing and looking at it, that it's not standing in front of you. It simply means that in order to make it materialize, you need some hardware. The hardware you need doesn't have dimensions, because the minute you bring in the concept of a dimension, you start immediately dividing space and time, at least in pre-21st century. So I'm going to say that again. The use of experience and the use of perception or intuition, think of it as your computer and not as the software on your computer. In web language, it would be, think of it as a web and not as the internet. Or rather, if that's too confusing, think of it as the web and not as an app. Okay, that probably didn't do anything. Okay, so let's go back to think of it as the web, think of it as the structure and not the infrastructure. So that's why I was saying to you, Sophie, that you were completely right about talking about it as subjective. The problem with that term subjective, until it's really very nuanced, is that it seems as though it's shiftable, because one, if they're standing here, can see it this way, if they're standing here, can see it this way, and so on and so forth. And that's not untrue necessarily, but think of it as your computer making you see it one way or another. Or, you know, you're flashing this on a foot. If it weren't on the foot, it would be something else, and it starts to shape shift. So yes, Oscar.
No.
Oh, sorry. So for example, the work that Grace is doing right now in understanding ectoplasm, or let's say understanding the so-called other world. Where does the other world, the dead, the half-living, half-dead, or wherever these creatures, where do they reside? To ask that question would be a nonsense. Well, it's a nonsense anyway, but it wouldn't get to anywhere to explaining how one can discuss let's say the reality of extrasensory perception, because the extrasensory perception is being developed using a tool, whether or not it's just charlatanism or an actual tool, that can bring together different forms of space and time, different slices, not forms, a slice of space and time. Does that make sense? I don't know if I made as much sense as I wanted to make. So I've asked the teams to come up with, like, the spatial team. I think that's very helpful, by the way, the spatial team and the temporal team, in order so that you can figure out how it shape shifts and why in the end Kant comes down on the side, as it were, of spatiality as a kind of way forward. But it's not without its time element. So I guess another way of posing this is, in the Einsteinian move, there is no such thing as time. Not 2:30, not 6:30, not in the linear sense. Time is always speed, connected with the way it goes through space. That's time. So time as as counting. or time as marking, like marking time, or time as something in that fashion, doesn't exist in the physics of understanding reality. Time is speed, time is distance, time is duration, but other than that, there is no such thing as time. It's not time versus space, there's space-time. And in fact, it goes further, Einstein goes further and calls it curved time. And curved time means, it's coming out of a Kantian move, where the way in which one grasps what it is that is temporal is precisely to grasp the way in which you have these intersections of your, let's say, computer formatting and what's being received as the information, the data, the metadata. It's so interesting to translate Kant into 21st century language. Not that I think it's working, so I'm not sure what you're hearing. Because I think that Clytemnestra and Agamemnon and the way in which that works, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the idea that someone gets killed off stage, but the off stage is the temporal environment, and in order to make it real, it has to be brought into the spatial environment, is very much part of a very specific kind of, writing and time period even. And that's the other thing. What do you do with things called time periods? What is the 19th century, 20th century? What are these things? Are they all palimpsests? How does one come at it? So Kant is going to have an answer to that question. Generally speaking, what do you think his answer would be? What would he call these things, 19th century, 20th century?
Attitudes.
That was a good guess, however wrong. But it was good, it was close, it's an A word.
Apodiectic.
It's even closer. What do you mean by that? That's a great word. How do you spell it?
Apodeic.
Good. And what does it mean? What does apodiectic mean?
That comes from the Latin, apodictus, which means literally to demonstrate.
And
So-
what is being demonstrated? What is an apodictic truth?
Well, something like you can demonstrate that it is, say, Shakespeare was written in the 17th century. You can say that that's a apodictic truth because you're looking like.
Well, let's say I said, people landed on the moon. Okay, technically you should be able to prove that, right? But there are people, hopefully not in this room, that don't believe that do think it's a big hype. Is there anybody in this room that thinks this? Good. We had a student in one of my classes a couple of years ago who absolutely was convinced that there was never the landing of anybody on the moon anywhere.
I have to say I have my doubts about that. I'm not sure about this.
Really?
No.
You think it was staged?
I don't understand why they couldn't come back. No,
They did come back.
seriously.
What?
But when?
Maybe 10, and then we respond. So how would, let's say I say that there was a man on the moon. That person was whatever his name was. I can't even think of his name was. Armstrong, yeah. And he made, one small step for man, one large thing for mankind, and so on and so forth. And let's say that was all drummed up at the Archer studio in Birmingham, right? Instead, how would you, using apodictic truth, how would you demonstrate the logic that Oscar's position is factually wrong? How would you be able, or that my position is factually? How would you demonstrate that in a proof? What does it mean to have this apodictic proof? Because this is what all your people are basing their arguments on. They're saying they have apodictic proof that ectoplasm exists, and then they show the little bits coming out of the ear and whatnot, and we all laugh and think, ha ha ha, it's so ridiculous. Meanwhile, back at the ranch with the man on the moon, okay, how do you prove that in fact is true? How do you demonstrate it? You take Oscar in a space capsule.
You can't share this with a film. Maybe a bit of lunar rock would convince them. I don't know. You probably wouldn't believe that.
I have heard things about Stanley Kubrick and kind of stories about how the NASA.
And you believe that over the Man on the Moon one?
Actually, yes. It's more no. I don't. I'm not saying that I believe one thing or another.
So
I'm just
how
saying
does one?
I'm not sure.
What's the
100%.
Kantian answer? What we're really getting at is, how would Kant begin to explain how one understands it to be true? We're going to use space and time. Space and time being this animal that has an odd property. It has the ability to ground something in the truth. It has ability to locate it. That is to say, it has an ability to make it so that you can repeat it more than once, and it's not just someone's opinion every time you say it. So, what does he call that? Starts with a J. Ends with a T. Judgment. Very good. Did you know that because you knew Scrabble, or?
She said Jay.
Going through and looking at other jurisprudence. Okay, judgment. What is it about a judgment? Critique of judgment, critique of pure judgment, critique of practical reason. What is it about these things that allows for an apodictic proof to maintain itself as true?
Something that comes at a priori.
Okay, there is something about the a priori. Yeah, good. What is the a priori? What does he call that a priori thing?
Because you need them to make.
Not because. What does he call the a priori? A priori what? A priori.
Synthetic unity.
Good. Okay. And the a priori synthetic unity is what? What is? Give me an example of an a priori synthetic unity. How we love Kant. I'm going to start giving lectures again. I can see this. Okay. Anyway, no, just kidding. What do you think?
This is a cup.
This is a cup. Now, how I said no, I said that's a car.
Okay.
And that's your answer?
No, I knew as soon as I said this is a cup, it was the wrong.
No, it's the right thing. It's just the question is, how do you make an apodictic proof?
Well, experience tells you.
Experience tells you
No.
only that experience tells you nothing,
Okay.
according to both Vickers and
Absolutely no exception. Rather than like a proof where it's.
apodictic is absolutely no exception.
Oh no, this contrast which I was noting down was the thing where the empirical universality is where there's no exception to rule so far can be observed. So induction, proof by induction, and contrasted with the strict universality, which is absolute, and there's no exception. I don't know how you prove that. So that's the side of the a priori stuff.
Say again?
Mathematics.
And how does mathematics help prove something?
Well, mathematics can be proven conceptually, not from, well, that's the category. It has to be something with intuition. It needs, that's why it's synthetic a priori. Mathematics in Kant has this intuition to it. And something that can be proved from concepts alone.
Right.
Because this critique of reason is a work that's looking at the theoretical realm of nature, at its base, and then beyond that we look at the laws and regularities that we find in nature. We apply the Kantian categories to perception, to come to judgment and experience. Judgment and perception being just compare and contrast, the basic kind of perceptual rolling on. By adding the concepts of understanding, we can then arrive at apodictic certainty. But at root, that nature and the regularity of nature, we add to that a techniques of nature, which is a practical understanding, which is not beyond the mathematics, which is part of that theoretical realm. So in the practical realm of using 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that's something that we've looked at, say, this movement of the sun and the moon and the earth, and taken certain customized Babylonian system of 360 degrees and worked out according to that. So we supply that to the world, like this 360 degrees. We could have picked another number, it could have been an Egyptian, it could have been somewhere Babylonian. So it's 360 degrees on the circle, and then everything's worked out from that. We then put that to the world. And that seems to work. There's a bit of, a bit of tinkering, because there's not a sphere in the world, like pedal wobbling around space. So there's
No, you're
always
good,
teeth,
yeah,
yeah,
good,
yeah.
good.
So,
So how is that apodictic? What
well,
makes it
yeah,
apodictic?
would be so it's an absolute certainty, necessity, which always seems to come back to a mathematical, because that's the most conceptually certain thing that we can think of. And we can think of it as in concept. Somebody mathematical might want to say something at this point, like I don't know, A equals Z, whatever, you know. So some kind of absolute certainty.
Okay, getting warmer, yeah, yeah.
Last week in the introduction, we concentrated on the difference between analytic and synthetic, which are two concepts that are not parallel but not perpendicular to a priori and posteriori.
Wait, they're not parallel, but they're also
No,
not.
they're perpendicular. But
They're not parallel or perpendicular.
Yes.
Okay, they're askew.
They sort of they can recoil around with a priori and posteriori. Analytic judgment, we were going to see, is judgment that does not need anything else outside the definition of identity or what is predicated. So, in a concept, someone unpacks the concept and finds attaching the identity of that concept, the number of things one can say. Synthetic, instead, is attaching to the concept something that one finds outside the concept, in the data that come from experience. So Kant uses experience a bit flexibly here, but in outside the concept, so one can as a synthesis of what one already knew plus something else.
Mm-hmm.
The guarantee of the apodictic judgment comes from combining two. Without the a priori, all the synthetic would be subjected in the weak perception. But without the a priori, it would also be impossible to make any real synthetic judgment, and vice versa. The apodictic, the analytic judgment by itself doesn't really go any far.
Okay, I have it. Yeah, that makes me think of this. Okay, here we have this apple, which is pretty sad. It's pretty soft. Okay. I did not drop it. Did anybody see me drop this?
Yeah.
I didn't drop it.
It is synthetic.
Did anybody see me drop this?
Yep.
Yeah, we all saw you drop it.
I didn't drop it. Prove to me that you saw it.
We all experienced you dropping it.
Prove that.
Well, we can only say it because
My hand is in the air.
No, whatever happened in front of us, whatever we perceive, it's the closest to what we experienced as dropping before. Or, like, we have prior knowledge of what dropping is, concept of dropping, and
So I go like
whatever
this,
that
and it
was.
does this little fall. Sorry. It rolls, and then I tell you I didn't drop it.
Well, that just negates the words.
I ask you, prove to me, or prove. I drop this thing. You go off now and prove. Let's say it's illegal for me to do that. I've now done that. Let's say if I do that, if I drop that apple, I'm going to be arrested. So I drop the apple. You've all seen me drop the apple. Now, how would you prove?
You have a representation.
You must have an H or a C. Let's think about this. All right, let's say it wasn't, let's say it wasn't being recorded. How would you prove? Because like the landing on the moon was recorded.
It could be a fake.
It could be a fake.
Yeah, something. It could be.
No, but in front of the video, we would have the same. We could have the same doubt that we have in front of the video act.
So I'm asking you,
Because
how would you prove? The police are standing out there. We hate each other, so
We
you
can
can
see
really.
the apple.
What's that?
Yeah.
The apple is
Dented.
massive or
Has
something.
moved or
The
bounced.
thing that thing is telling you the truth about
Can I have
that
a-
is
What
the
do you mean
fact.
that thing is telling me the truth?
It's like you're looking for an actual
You dropped me, you bastard. No, how is it telling me anything?
It's move from one place.
What does it
to
mean to
another.
do a proof, a logical proof?
Because we have, as
It's
says,
empirical data, maybe, isn't it?
Yes, okay, good.
but the empirical
Personal
data by
faith.
themselves are not
Empirical.
proving anything. It's because the old trick of Kant, and he's a very, very, very clever and subtle, is that he says, look,
A true magician.
I called it trick, and then I thought, no, I don't give him justice, so that it's much more than a trick. He describes time and space intuitions in different ways. The space intuition is one about the simultaneous presence of things, and the time intuition is the one about the alteration of things, or the sequence of one come after the other. And these are two empty forms. They are presenting nothing but the possibility of sequence and the possibility of simultaneity. Then one fits into these schemas or these filters. Whatever comes from the senses, literally from the senses, and then one can say that I saw the apple going from here to here in a sequence, therefore something took place. So I need the two a priori forms to organize the raw data into a judgment, which is in this case is synthetic.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives me the possibility to say your claim is wrong.
Okay, so let's pretend you all have on Geneva lawyers' gowns, or what people wear these days. Of course, in the English court of law, you also have the actual little wigs and things. Okay, so let's say we're all in the court of law, and I claim I have not dropped the apple. You claim, you're defending, you're the prosecutor, right? So you're saying Johnny has dropped the apple. Okay, now, you're going to call some witnesses. What are you going to expect them to say? What will allow the witness statement to work? That's right. That's right. Yes, very good.
But
Jacob comes back to life.
That would
Goes
be
back
a
quietly again.
witness.
Okay, so the witness says, I saw this, and what happens if I say, but it's Jacob, you know, is he a credible witness?
Foreign, I should be.
Yeah, that's right. Is there any way that I could make, or that, Stuart, you can be my defendant, okay?
Bishop.
Yeah, I am, actually.
Would you like on the line?
So how would you defend me against this horrific accusation? And that Jakob is saying that I did drop this.
You'd undermine them in some way, wouldn't you? So
Yes, and how would you do that?
By attacking their character or their...
Right, and why would their character matter to the dropping of the bloody
prove
apple?
they're
Because their
unreliable.
perception is not right. That they're
Right, okay, and so we're coming back to the notion of perception as being fundamental to this staging of time and space. See or no?
Yes, but it is such a subtle and delicate moment in the thought here of Kant, because if you remember when he starts, the first line of the introduction says everything,
Comes from experience.
whatever, no, sorry, comes from experience, exactly. There can be no doubt that all of our knowledge begins with experience.
Right.
And we think, here we are.
That's kind of what I said.
That's right. You can bop them on the head, you know.
And it would seem that he's taking the empiricist side. And then he starts slicing experience
Right.
in a number of logical moments or layers.
Right.
Where he says, well, experience is actually already something composed as a compound.
Mm-hmm.
That is a compound of raw data of perception, the senses,
Mm-hmm.
and these a priori forms that organize the raw data.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, we haven't got there yet, but there is even more than just tame and spice. Space and time.
Tame and spice, I like that.
To organize is because then one goes up into higher in the level, or the architecture as he calls it, into with the intellectual categories that organizes this first layer. But to experience is a compound, is already synthetic.
Right, and synthetic because it's a compound.
It's a compound because it has what it calls pure intuition forms, space and time.
Remembering that pure intuition is like the pure computer.
Yeah, it's the fact that there is a computer.
Okay,
And
good.
the fact that there is a computer made in a certain
I'm
way
sorry to anyone who's listening to this that thinks of
has
reducing everything to the computers.
has some possibilities and not others.
Okay,
So when your question earlier, can you see computer art without computers? Obviously not, because you cannot see on film, film. You cannot see drawn, painted, or written. You need a computer to see computer art. And
sort of. Go on. Could you see a painting without paint? Of course, Jacqueline, we need her. Could you see painting without paint?
well, it depends on how far the definition of painting goes.
I know I'm being cruel and horrible. I'm sorry. I am being harsh here. I mean,
But what I'm saying is that it's. Well, I was going to explain it with some relation because the ideas from Benjamin understanding of cinema.
yeah, go on.
To me, the fundamental part of Benjamin's analysis of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility is not much what he says cinema and photography can do in the 30s. It's the fact that he says that it's meaningless to expect of cinema and photography to do what painting and sculpture have done before, because they have different dimensions. And therefore they will create meaning differently, and they will create a different meaning as well.
Good.
And that's, to me, is the most important part of Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or the most important part of that part.
yeah,
of
that Benjamin's on the media award. Now, Kant is saying the same because it's the root of Benjamin. Benjamin was a neo-Kantian.
Don't say that. Just
But-
how is Kant saying the same?
Because he's saying our way to engage with the world is firstly, through the intuition of space and time. There is no getting in touch with the world without space and time. Now, it goes on to, by example, say we can imagine, we can never imagine any object outside of space and time, but we can imagine space and time pure. So it goes closer to Newton than it seems, but it never.
No, you're good. This is good.
So we cannot engage with the world without these two dimensions of space and time. However,
Well, these two axes.
axes, yes, because yeah. However, what is fundamental is that these two axes, these two forms of intuitions, are ours. In this sense, they are subjective.
Right.
They are not out there.
They're not subjective in the sense that it's my opinion, your opinion, someone
No,
else's
but
opinion.
also it's
Good.
not that it's subjective as in when I said an idealist earlier that I am dreaming it all. The word is there,
Mm-hmm.
but the word is there in a way that is unreachable for us unless we filter it through space and time.
Did everybody get that?
Yeah, I think it's to do with his notions of change and motion, maybe, the thing about dropping.
Good. Can you explain that?
Well, he says that time itself doesn't change, only something in time changes. So we know that the apple dropped, we saw that happen, and time didn't change, but the apple itself changed,
Mm-hmm.
moved. And then he says it's all to do with our perception of experience. So it's sort of, I don't know, I just think that
Getting warm. We're getting very warm. So let's just put this on the table just so we have this. So you can think about. I think let me try it this way. What I'm hoping this seminar is doing right now for you is making you see in techna dimension, rather like it used to be a thing called Technicolor. That was last century's thing. This is techna dimension. So rather than thinking space, time, something like that, we're thinking space and time. Everything has these axes through which the point that they meet allows one a platform, or let's say a ground, or in fact a groundless ground, around which you can make an argument. The argument is the establishment of a proof. The establishment of a proof, an argument has to do with a proof, by the way. It's not an argument if you're just raising your voice. That's not an argument. An argument is when you're trying to establish something with a proof. Otherwise it's an opinion, no matter how loud or soft you are. So the platform, or the thing that grounds so that you're able to set up this apodectic proof, allows that to happen when you know that you're dealing with this colorful version of dimension. By colorful, I mean space-time. Space being that which is indicating duration, so I even call it length, movement. So it's not just this cup or this folder. That's the Platonic move. The Platonic move is like holding a cup inside of which you put different, like the category of love, or the category of sight, or the category of color, and you put different colors in it, different forms in it. It's a form. The Platonic has a form. Kant is not speaking about forms here. It's kind of the inverse of that. It's the form is shaped because of the axes of time and space. And that's why, whether or not you come at it through this, let's say, lens of time, which is going to be a very narrow lens in a certain sense, or this lens of space, which is equally going to be narrow, when you start understanding that, as Mattia's saying here, this kind of multiplicity of axes, that's when you're going to be able to begin the small baby steps of setting up your platform in order to come up with, let's say, layers in your case, or the way in which one reaches outside, inside different movements of your work, or the feedback loop. And this, you're needing this multiplicity of dimension in order to talk about truth, in order to actually situate the truth. Now, going back to this problem, dropping the apple, and me claiming I haven't done it. Let's say I just say, you know, actually Andre did it. Andre dropped the apple. Didn't you?
Could have.
Okay. Remind me not to. No, Andre, you did not drop the apple.
No. Take the blame.
That's right.
I'm Spartacus.
That's right. I did drop the apple. You know, we all dropped the apple. Oh God. So that would be another thing. How does this become something other than a political question? Or is Kant always already political? Or to push it even further, is space and time always already political?
Yes. Yes. Unless you radicalise the relationship between them.
What do you mean, unless you do that?
Because if the relationship between the two axes is...
You're moving out of your comfort opinion zone, you realize that?
No, I'm not.
Okay, let me see.
Habit is the habitual relationship between space and
Don't use the word in the definition.
Okay.
Habit is the...
repeated, the expectation. And radical art breaks the expectation by changing the relationship between space and time.
So, but that's also political, no?
Yeah.
Okay, but what I'm also saying, or what me and Emmanuel are saying, is that there is something inherent about this relationship between time and space that is apodectically always already political.
Yes, because the two are phenomenon for each other.
Mm-hmm.
So one perceives time as a phenomenon of space, or through space, but locates it through space and vice versa. And one perceives, that's an important part, one's own perception of or representation of time and space as phenomenon, but nothing else of oneself. So one constantly builds one's own perception, and through these two filters. So as there is no real reality outside for me to reach, there is not even a real inner reality for me to reach.
Right.
And for the continuous filtration or repackaging, which I actually like better, creates a subject.
Mm-hmm. Want to say that again? Because that is the big leap. That's what created the links between, let's say, the radical division between Kant and Hegel, for one, because of the putting at the base of the logic that everything is always already political.
Yes.
And that's very different than saying that everything is always already there, let's say. Or to say that something is political does not necessarily mean it's ideological. It means that it is subject to actual interventions.
Also,
And that's complicated, because then it might lend to what Oscar's saying, which is to say that the landing on the moon is false.
in the past, we attempted to read more than once the lessons on the analytic of the sublime of Lyotard.
Mhm.
In the first
You
chapter,
attempted to.
yes, because we never went past the first chapter.
Yes, still upset about it. Years later.
In that first chapter, also accompanied with a text that Dana suggested, which comes from Newman, Reflections on Time. No, we read one chapter about the paintings of Barnes Newman, where Lyotard presents the sublime as the possibility, or the feeling, the image of the possibility of time stopping flowing. But that would mean simply the possibility of this continuous repackaging of the phenomenon of time by the phenomenon of space, and the phenomenon of space by the phenomenon of time creating the subject to stop happening, therefore breaking down all identity.
So how does this Kantian, this new move with being political, how does it affect your own thesis? Does it?
For me, yes, in me directly.
Yeah. Can you explain how?
Well, because instead of having, it's the same problem we discussed when we started reading Leibniz. Instead of having a space already there, that by being defined as already there is somehow bound, or is somehow expressed in its totality, and then placing in it object and subjects, which in the same way, because they are placing it separately, are already expressed in their totalities. And I always think of these as the problem with art. Art does not exist before we make something that then we call art. And then each time we make something new, we expand it. We don't feel an area that has been called art in areas that have been like little cells that we feel yet. So if the identity of the subject or the identity of sense, for this matter, which is what I'm more interested in, are constantly synthesized by this continuous packaging of each other, of the phenomenon of space by the phenomenon of time, the phenomenon of time, the phenomenon of space, and growing, they grow as, again, they is a great source of intuitions for me. The universe does not expand into a space, the universe expands itself.
Right.
And therefore it's not an equation but an algorithm. That's precisely what is happening here.
Yes. So that is let me just recap that so you can kind of hear it. Or kind of hear it slightly differently in case you haven't heard it. So it's not that there is like a cup inside of which things are put. So it's not like the form and you're putting concepts in there or whatever. It's that it expands to be what it is. So if it comes in, it's the same. If it goes out, it's the same. It is itself moving on a continual basis. The difference being is that this itself has a political, has its logic in the political. And that's this is a move where you have people like Foucault or Lyotard or Adorno pulling certain things out of Kant, going back to Kant because of this relationship between the way in which the political and then the judgment and the aesthetic judgment begin to form apodictic truth. And this is, someone like Husserl, for example, begins to develop this, not exactly in this manner, but I mean, the argument that he puts forward origins of geometry is around sedimentation, which goes into your layering. This whole question of how does sedimentations create, like the bedrock, to use the same sort of arguments around, you know, earth forming, that forms knowledge. These kind of layerings. If you cut into a rock, you'd see these layerings, and it's a different form of what's difficult to grasp, I guess, is that it's a different form of how one understands how a layer is established, how an edge is established, how a fold is established. And it's drawn from this Kantian move that's happening right here around this relationship between space and time. Other questions so far? Stuart, do you have any? Is this like, or is it like actually, what's happening here? Is it making sense or not making sense, or how's it? Are you happy with the way we're going? Because it's a very quiet group. It's become very quiet, even though there's a lot of energy here.
So maybe there's something a bit like Grace's paper title. She's still, was it in planes?
Vanishing in plain sight.
There's something of that there. It's almost like it's so obvious.
You mean with the Kantian move?
Yeah, yeah. And it's trying to align it to working as an artist. Yeah.
There's the connection between appearance and apparition. It's just in the work, is it? In art as well. The way things appear and appearance. This example of the apple, rock apple, it's just all the marks of an apparition appearance that is vanishing. It's vanished. So it's very hard to work it up into a judgment of experience and objective truth. And this level that we're looking at now, this sort of level of perception, there is synthetic posteriori perceptions as well, so let's not forget that, which are this basic. I wanted to ask Mattia, troubles early, how raw is your data? You talk about raw data.
You can't quantify that, it's just beyond these
in these judgments of perception, they compare, contrast and abstract. They will give you, if you're looking at a round blob on horizon, stuff becomes a tower, or I'm walking along, is it a person in the bushes, is it a person, it's a post? You know, it just resolves itself. This to me, as I understand, it still works at the level of representation, perception, that side, before any kind of applicative exercity, or any application of things like substance, the categories as such. And this is why it interests me, because it's rather a bit like music, which doesn't quite fit into his three-dimensional Euclidean geometrical idea of space and substance. It's not a substance. It throws up huge umbilical lumps of words like tower. And I'm wondering, when it's like political, it's those kind of uncontested areas of the word that names the thing, which still isn't a concept. To give something a name is not to conceptualize it. So I thought it was very interesting, but let's concentrate on this, as you said, this horizon of understanding level of representation, which it then itself becomes the object of representation for the conceptual machinery that you then bring to it. So my question was, when you talk about raw data, how you understand not like
I was trying to actually go back
data.
The first paragraph of the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements.
Data's not very capable, is it?
No, it's not.
That's right.
The first paragraph of the Transcendental Doctrine of the Elements, which is B33.
Yeah. So it's really back on page 65 if you have the Norman Kemp translation. Yeah.
There it comes back. Whatever the process and the means may be by which knowledge refers to its objects, intuition is that through which it refers to them immediately. But that is really a trick, because intuition then needs to be unpacked. And at which although all thought aims as means. But intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. This again is only possible for us human beings at least, when the mind is affected by the object in a certain way. So this is directly trying to answer Mark. So the capacity or receptivity to obtain a representation to the way in which we are affected by object is called sensibility. Objects are therefore given to us by means of our sensibility. Sensibility alone supplies us with intuitions. Intuition are thoughts to understanding, and that goes
So
up.
it's a bit of a circular thing in that sense. I mean, here it's.
In a certain way, in the text, Kant does not give descriptions or information about individual instances of knowledge happening, taking place. He is concerned with the logic of knowledge or the methodology of knowledge. And it is true that when you get to such detailed moments, is it a post or a person, you would find here how to articulate that, because he's not even discussing the five senses. He sort of somewhere brushes them aside, saying it's not this what we're talking about. We're talking about something purer.
Yeah, it has struggles with the notion of event, doesn't it? This work.
Yes.
Notion of event.
Well, it is prior to the discussions on events,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
But if we can.
And then, sorry, could I then jump? Paragraph 6 instead, the one titled Conclusion from these Concepts, B50.
B50.
B50, yes. And just before elucidation, just before what we were reading now,
Okay.
it sort of gives a good summary of the problem we've been discussing, because he starts saying the conclusion from these concepts. Time is not something which exists by itself, or which adheres to things as an objective determination. Not something, therefore, that might remain when abstraction is made from all the subjective condition of our intuition. For in the former case, it would be something actual, and yet not be an actual object. So if time existed by itself, it would be actual without being an actual object, which is a contradiction. In the latter case, time could not, as a determination or order adhering to things themselves, precede the objects as their condition, and could not be known and intuited a priori through synthetic proposition. And here he explains a bit better. But this last is quite possible if time is nothing but the subjective condition under which alone all intuition can take place within us. Nothing but the subjective condition under which alone all intuition can take place within us. For in that case, this form of an inner intuition can be represented prior to the objects, that is, represented a priori. And the same goes for space. They are symmetrical.
So why does Heidegger, though he does change this later, why does Heidegger suggest that time has been wrongly positioned until he came along, and that actually time, in the way it's being positioned, until he has sort of resurrected a different way of doing it, does not take into consideration thinking? Or, to put it in more positive ways, in what way does time take on the element of thinking, or the realm of thinking?
Well, in Heidegger, it's using the senses, isn't it? It's essential. Yeah.
But how does Heidegger do that?
Being.
Yes, it has to do with being.
Big B and little b.
Yeah, so it has to do with this relationship, the Dasein relationship that goes on. Okay.
But there is something else, I believe, that Heidegger is criticizing that wouldn't immediately, I like Kant better than Heidegger, but I could see that from the point of view of Heidegger, Kant still deals within the wider paradigm of ontology. But in other words, Kant is trying to find a way that describes how a sentient and thinking subject can engage with reality and know what reality is, therefore to be able to predict with certainty. And although Kant is the one that initiates this move of correlation between the subject and reality, the very fact that it poses the noumen, or the reality itself, beyond somehow leaves the outer frame of the paradigm intact.
Yes, does.
And instead, Heidegger tries to get all the way to the frame, saying,
Mhm.
well, time is the what relates us to it. But is this really conceding that?
So you think that Kant is more of a leg up, is more of a useful way into the discussions around aesthetics, let's say, because
it's more dynamic than Heidegger, because in the end Heidegger looks for an authentic solution. A solution that Heidegger finds, to me, is far more static than the problem he finds in Kant.
and that is because the way it is found in Kant, what happens?
Well, because the way it is found in Kant is empty is not the right word. Is somehow, it's a metaphor, but the methodology that Kant proposes is an algorithm. Doesn't carry information of its content.
So what's the difference between an algorithm and an equation?
An equation is puts a frame around everything, sees what everything is, and finds a divider, the equal sign, that says, well, if I got this much, I have to have this much of the other. It implies a separation in two parts.
Okay.
And no matter how complex.
So the whole is perceived.
The whole is perceived. When I can put a distance and see the whole. An algorithm is somehow blind, because the algorithm just repeats itself. You know, the basic algorithm will be just a game, without anything else attached to it.
It's generative.
It's generative and it's active, and that's exactly what the monad was. And the principle of the monad is to be an active principle that then can have infinite variations, but is an active principle, and therefore expands the universe without expanding inside a specific space that will exist.
It's iterative, isn't it?
Sorry?
Yes,
It's
iterative.
iterative.
Good.
Iterative, yes.
Yes, very important. So let's do a little summary here. I know that I know we can move forward. What do you remember about Kant so far? You're not allowed to speak. But that was a very important and good summary, actually.
Kant pills. If you these, you remember it all.
What's this?
These are Kantian pills.
Yes. That's brilliant. So what if we were to put a few things on the board, what that will then come into your theses? What would they be? You already written your thesis. But not necessarily the inner outer side of it. How did the discussion shift that position? Did it for you?
I'm just getting my head around algorithms, sorry.
Okay.
I'm still in the previous
Sentence.
Yeah.
What are we going to take from the Kantian move?
Well, the algorithms are technically practical. They don't name a reality other than the reality that we place upon the world. That's the point, isn't it? The world could be other. As one of the finite infinite argument in the Zeno of Newton. So I think that for me, this theoretical realm stays focused on nature, a certain positions of the world.
Yeah.
So to me, all the questions sort of come coloured in nature. So with the theoretical thinking about it, always to me, it's always about planets and cosmos and how we start thinking those kind of directions, or just how nature, the world, leaks out. It already sets up a sort of framework, a sort of general orientation towards an understanding which is different than if we suddenly sort of went down the practical route of the practical understanding, and different again once you bring in the critique of judgment. So whenever I look at this, there's already a set of images, as it were, related to nature, and the same when you start talking about the sublime and the beautiful in Kant, it already sets up a whole chain of perceptions, if you like, that are
Sorry.
Just a technical question.
that belong to me, as it. And how could illustrate this maybe is that in this idea of representation in Kant, the appearance of representation, what appears in space and time, the representation which then itself becomes the object of representation. In the German, this is called the Vorstellung, in this whole representation.
Yes.
But for Kant, it means the whole representational machinery, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Other, like Hegel, the Vorstellung, the representation, he doesn't need a word to explain the whole conceptual machinery. It only goes far as the perception.
Of the actual
as
perception, yeah.
And it has a huge component called picture thinking within it, which Kant doesn't even really come across, doesn't mention at all. So inside the representation within Hegel, you have with it this thing called picture thinking. It's just the images that come with the thoughts, that arise with the thoughts and pass away with the thoughts. They have no apodeictic certainty, but they are there as part of the representation machine in Hegel, which is why I very much like playing compare and contrast, not in this Kantian move on to it, just in terms of just interesting. The two different kinds of intuition that you get in Kant and in Hegel. So where in Kant the intuition is all talk around the space and time, in Hegel intuition is more like attention drawn and how you are drawn to things. There's a whole different understanding. So starting from these two different objects in the world, if you like, that stands over against us in the Hegel, you can run through. They're very similar conceptual machines, but there's enough difference to make them philosophically really interesting when you inhabit them, because they have a different path, journey. They're trying to get to the same objective necessity, but they have a slightly different way of going about it. And it's in the comparing and contrasting that I find there's a richness within these idealistic philosophies.
And one of the things that's very helpful there, Mark, I mean, one of the things that you need to bear in mind then is that with the Hegelian move, it allows him to come up with a notion, it allows him to come up with a dialectical reasoning that will in fact not have to go outside itself to make its position tenable. Whereas in the Kantian move, because it's more algorithmic, let's say, than it is, I mean, to just push that, it's more coming in this sense to form itself than in the sense of expressed through the totality of something that synthesizes. You have a different process that is even ignited. And as a result, you have different forms of the political that get addressed. And that too becomes an interesting feature. Now, what I hope we're going to see if we get past the critique of practical reason and pure reason and into the critique of judgment is the way in which this then becomes, the Kantian move becomes sine qua non for understanding contemporary art, and why it becomes as well for people to draw from it. Lyotard, Deleuze, Guattari, they're drawing from this very specific move that Kant is making, but we haven't quite, we're getting there, but we haven't quite hit that stride. So I guess my question to you is, do you want to continue with the critique? I mean, all I see here is like very thorough.
Can I say something? Maybe it's because of this idea of concept that is different. It's independent of the object. The concept is the object plus all these time, space, and all the things you put together to understand the object. So there is not object, and in the concept is other thing.
No, the concept and the object are linked. Be very careful about that.
Yes, I'm linked.
No, not just linked. They're expressed, they're not linked like this, they are inseparable. So it's more than linked. The concept and the object are inseparable from each other.
Yes, but I'm thinking about the sensitive thing.
Sensation.
Different from the senses of just the sense of the object. This kind of separation.
Okay. Yeah.
To this, I once said a few years back, I was speaking with Daniel who was working on photography, I believe that this notion of time and space as transcendental that could be presented or explained with a parallel. For photography, light is the condition of the possibility of photography. If there will be no light whatsoever, there will be no photography. It doesn't matter if it is analog or digital. No information will go through the lens to the camera. And the same is for us to see colors, we need light. Light is none of the colors. Light is not photography. But without light, that's the a priori condition for all the endless variations of colors or of images that are then taken to exist. Time and space are these. That is a priori condition that is transcendental because in itself they are not. And this is why often I thought of it as a language. Language is not exhausted in any of us, but doesn't exist by itself.
Right. That is the point, if there is the point, that is the point for this book right now, is trying to grasp what is it that forms the ground, in this case. If it's not light, then it's the space, it's space and time, but not space and time, not in axes. And so you were all right to have an allergic reaction to me dividing in between space and time. That was the right reaction. And still you persevere to try and come at it to see if you could articulate the abstraction of the light, of the space versus the time. If you can see that they're not inseparable and yet they are discrete elements, we get warmer to this. And so you're right that becomes, the notion of the transcendental becomes important here, because without that notion, you cannot begin to understand how something forms its truth as opposed to its opinion. That was perfect.
I like the way he says that Leibniz and Wolfgang philosophies are wrong. He just kind of writes that out.
Yes, and what does it, where are we on that? What page?
This is, well, in mine it's 57, so it's the general remarks on transcendental aesthetic, which I've got as 9, but I'm not sure it's the same.
B61?
Yeah.
And he says it must be admitted that the Leibniz-Wolfian philosophy has assigned an entirely erroneous point of view to all investigations into the nature and origin of our cognitions, inasmuch as it regards the distinction between the sensuous and the intellectual as merely logical, whereas it is plainly transcendental and concerns not merely the clearness or obscurity.
Wait. I still haven't found where you're reading. Sorry.
B62?
What is it? B62?
Yes. Paragraph 8. And it's the end, halfway through point.
Oh yeah, right. Okay. Can you start again with that?
It must be admitted that the Leibniz-Wolfian philosophy has assigned an entirely erroneous point of view to all investigations into the nature and origin of our cognitions, inasmuch as it regards the distinction between the sensuous and the intellectual as merely logical, whereas it is plainly transcendental, and concerns not merely the clearness or obscurity, but the content and origin of both.
Very important. Now, for those of you that have the Norman Kemp Smith translation, it reads, "The philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff, in thus treating the difference between the sensible and the intelligible as merely logical, has given a completely wrong direction to all its investigations into the nature and origin of our knowledge. This difference is quite evidently transcendental. It does not merely concern their logical form as being either clear or confused. It concerns rather their origin and content. It is not that by our sensibility we cannot know the nature of things in themselves in any save a confused fashion. We do not apprehend them in any fashion whatsoever. If our subjective constitution be removed, the represented object with the qualities which sensible intuition bestows upon it is nowhere to be found and cannot possibly be found, for it is this subjective constitution which determines in its form as appearance." Now, that's a fantastic paragraph to cite, particularly in what we're talking about here, hold on, because we have now on the table, which I think, I just let you know, I just love our seminars. I mean, I think you guys do a lot of really wonderful hard work, because not only have you cracked the code of the transcendental, but Sophie, you've now put on the table the problem between those that argue there is no such thing as transcendental, and those that argue there's no such thing as transcendence, and those that say there's only transcendental, or those that say there's the quasi-transcendental. Now, are you alive enough to hear that problem? Because I think that that's the key here. I mean, that's yet another key, several keys were jailers. So the one key is the transcendental. And the transcendental, the thing to grasp around this problem of the transcendental is to say that you need an unsayable something to ground, to give an entity an apodectic truth. And because it can't be located anywhere in time nor in space, but on the other hand, it's not located nowhere, so it's not, sorry, too many negatives. It is neither located everywhere, nor is it located nowhere. It's located in the transcendental, this groundless ground. This thing that could be seen as an algorithm expression, that is, say, it grows from itself. As it grows, it is still itself. And to make any sense of it, you need a transcendental materiality. That's version 1. Then there's the version that says you cannot have any transcendental materiality, because if you have any form of transcendental materiality, you will invoke the some form of space and time, which no matter how you argue, you're not doing it. You are, in fact, bringing in categories called space and time. All good. Okay. The third is then the question of the transcendence, which tends to mean the way in which a sublation operates. So something an abstraction gets incorporated into some other abstraction, taken as a whole, creates the concrete reality of its being. Now, I'm going to put that to one side because we're not going to get into that whole notion of transcendence. But the transcendental is attacked by thinkers like Foucault, and it's sort of attacked by thinkers like Derrida, because he gets into the quasi-transcendental. For Derrida, and for Heidegger, and for a number of people, the transcendental, no matter how else you want to put it, still invokes a messianic move. And Derrida and others are not willing to let go of that messianic move. Then you have someone like Foucault, and certain text in Deleuze, and certain text in, not all of them, in Leibniz, that do not want to go anywhere near the transcendental. That they're arguing there's got to be some other way to talk about that which has no ground, other than saying that it's this thing called transcendental and therefore invoking a messianism, some kind of God, some kind of spirit. And that's the dilemma. Heidegger tried to break with it and couldn't. And so he ended up with the ontotheologic ground. We saw with Braver, in his famous Groundless Grounds book, that he tried to break with it, but the best, which was pretty good, that he could do was to show how Wittgenstein versus Heidegger were able, in different ways, to come to this more or less the same conclusion, which is that you couldn't break with it. We'll go back to Kant, who's saying don't even think about breaking with it, because in fact the word transcendental ought to be understood for what it actually is, whether or not it's invoking God or not, because he's accusing Leibniz of saying you keep saying you're not invoking God, but these monads have very godlike features. And therefore, we're going back to something else. Kant, I'm going to call this the transcendental, and it's going to be a form of a material immateriality, or an immaterial materiality, however you want to put it. And that's where we're stuck right now in the 21st century. Because at the end of the day, one still wants to say something around how does something manage its truth functions. And the reason the question of the truth function is essential, is critical, is crucial, or whatever the right word is, for art, is because you want to be able not to put a category on the art, but to have the art put the category, as it were, on the truth. And if it's not doing that, then according to Kant, it's not art. So you can't make a claim as to what is art, but if art's not doing its job of forming truth, then it's not art, no matter what else is doing. So hopefully we can move to the aesthetic of judgment, the critique of judgment, so you can see how he develops this argument. He moves from this question of the transcendental into this very odd form, very rich form of how one begins to understand the poetics that then Heidegger starts to steal, but this poetics of how one understands this breathing animality, this breathing vitality called space and time, or space-time. And that's a Kantian move that Einstein picks up on. So this is where it gets complicated. Not that it wasn't complicated before. So the dropping of the apple that I was doing earlier today, and the way in which I say to you, I take a fascist position. That's normally considered a fascist position. I do something, and then I, with a completely straight face, tell you I did not do it, and you all saw it. And then I provoke you to saying, will you back me on it? That is old-fashioned fascism. The George Orwell type, how many fingers, you ever see this, how many of the Animal Farm, how many fingers do I have up? I have 4 fingers up. And anyone that says anything else will be beheaded. It's like that kind of thing. So you learn how to follow rules through fear and through the quiet movement of power, because what really makes you make that decision is something else that's going on in the room. And what I was really trying to get you to see, which I think you did see, was in dropping the apple and saying, I didn't drop it, are you going to defend me? There's people out there who are going to take me away. What's really happening is to show you how the truth got established, not because I dropped the apple or not, but how the power relations come in to form the political fabric around which you know what you're seeing. Because you know what you're seeing. So the question is, are you going to be able to rely on your eyesight? If not your eyesight, then your brain sight. If not your brain sight, then your gut sight. What are you relying on? What is to be the function of what in order to form an apodectic truth? And that's what Kant is getting at. I don't know if that speech is making any sense here. Now the music comes up, Mark?
Well, the questions of truth, it's interesting because I've got piles of books about this argument of truth that want to be read. Concerning sort of pragmatist philosophers like Richard Rorty, especially has a very kind of loose understanding of truth, and then hard analytical philosophers like Taylor, who wrote the book on Hegel.
Yeah, Charles Taylor.
And this argument of what is truth and stuff is somehow, maybe it's not been out, actually, it's kind of missed me. It's not been on the table. So I'm happy to see it return, these questions about what is truth. It'd be really interesting to go back and explore some of the arguments that this whole Rorty especially had to defend himself against his kind of loose, weak notion of what a truth is, against these really hard-nosed Nagel, people like this, hard-nosed people analytic who really want to get back to this academic certainty of Kant, whereas someone like Rorty would say, well, why do we even bother with Kant in the first place? You know, it's probably we're past that Kantian moment and it's this kind of thing, but philosophy still keeps going back to Kant. So Kant is the central thing. So I'm really pleased to see these arguments come off the shelf again.
But so that you
that's where we're going.
That is where
one
we're
of the
going.
places we can go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the questions I think that's that isn't too far away from at least my heart here is, you know, I mean, without trying to sound too like bloodletting and sad, the world is changing at a very fast pace and not in a good way these days. If you hear one more interview with Nigel Farage, I mean, you know, and then they wonder how this man can, you know, get elected if he's the only one. Anyway, side one. But what is fascinating is the way in which the ball is dropped by the banks, and then the banks tell you that is not what's happened. And then they tell it to you again and again and again. And eventually, you have very intelligent people going, well, it's not really the banks. I mean, you know, it's really, you know, and it's becoming fascinating to me how the more one developed a middle class, a wider middle class, the more the question of truth became not quite as, it wasn't really flavor of the month in a certain sense, because there are other things you could, the multiplicity of identities, and you know, and in fact identity wasn't even a question. And now it's like things are shrinking, and one needs to get a sense the music is going to stop, and you're going to have to grab a chair, and you better hope there's a chair to grab, because the chairs are being removed. Fast, fast, fast. If you think what's happening at this university is something, you should see what's going on in the whole of the country or in the whole of Europe and so on and so forth. It's very scary. So these little seminars that we're having at the moment are very, you know, kind of hardcore and or difficult, and we're trying to figure out the politics of it. Learn your lessons well while you can, because when the music stops, it's gonna be rough. You're gonna have to really know your stuff. So it's you know, as you know, I come from a Jewish background, and one of the things that happens is a thing called Passover. I mean, honestly, where the angel passes over, you know, the houses of the people that are Jewish, and they put a little mezuzah, a little thing on their door so the angel knows not to go there. You think of it as an angel, they actually figured this out, but anyway, apparently they needed a sign, and so they pass this. And then there's this whole Seder that happens over a couple of nights, and the youngest child has to answer 4 questions. Well, there's 4 questions that are asked. And there's 4 children that there's the what question, there's the how question, there's the where question, and the why question. And the why question is always the evil question. The kid that asks the why question is supposed to be the one that is really annoying, because that always leads back to God and therefore doesn't allow you to think. And so there's a whole thing that happens in the Seder around, you know, you must learn how to think. While this is all going on, there's this thing called the matzah, which is a flat bread, and they break the matzah, and half of it is hidden. And it's called the afikomen. Believe me, this is about the extent of my Jewish background, okay, so you're hearing the whole bit. That's hidden, and the little kids, the youngest one in particular, but whatever, they're supposed to find this afikomen. And then they come back, and the Seder can't go on until the children agree to give back the afikomen. And so they get to negotiate with the adults. And the moral to the story is to teach your children when they're young how to negotiate in a kind of playful and fun way, because at some point they'll be negotiating for their lives. When they have the little afikomen and they're saying, well, I'm not going to let you start until you, and you've got to get the grown-ups to agree, that's the training session. So so in that particular part of the religion, they're trying to get the kids, the little kids, to learn how to be playful, have a playful moment when something gets stolen and something is hidden, and then in order to get it back you need to negotiate. So I say this to you because the same thing is happening right now. The world is becoming very ugly. Well, it's pretty ugly anyway, but it's even becoming more ugly. And I mean, it's also beautiful, and let's not get overlooked, but you know, you need to get a sense of how it's operating. Does this transcendental logic work? Does your art matter? Never let anyone take away your art. no matter what they say, no matter how many fingers they point up and they say, there are 4 fingers here, you know that the artwork is important. You gotta figure out how to make it stick, as it were. That's the whole game here, you know, and it's getting much more tighter game going on. So that's why we do these like annoying, where's the transcendental? Where's the transcendence? Where is this thing? That's why we're trying to get you, all of us are the we here, trying to figure out how this operates, because like I said, the music will stop, the chairs will be grabbed, and maybe there won't even be a chair, at all for anyone to grab. And then that's gonna be a whole nother issue. But that's why I want us to do this, and I'm trying to think of different clever, fun ways to figure out how to do that, how you learn which is the logic that's gonna help make this a better world. Not that logic makes it a better world, but logic in the widest sense, logic in the living sense. So that's why we're doing this kind of stuff. Does that make any sense? I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound like, I'm just so annoyed about the EU elections right now and everything else that's going on. And the fact that this poor woman who's married
that's terrible.
a Christian person and getting killed and, and whatever, on and on it goes. It's just like, lift a rock, find some other garbage that's going on. You just think, really? How is that possible? How is that possible? Anyway, but it is possible. And the question is how to not make it probable. That's the key here. And how do those power regimes get established? How does that happen? How does it get reflected in your own work? Because every little bit you do will matter. And when people start saying to you it doesn't matter, change the subject on them. That's the key. That was Gramsci's old motto. If they tell you that it doesn't matter, you're talking to the wrong people. Because it actually does matter. And the first group of people that tells you it doesn't matter are exactly the people who know it matters. So in order not to go back to these bifurcated ways, these like hardcore lines between the haves and the have-nots, the wildly poor and the minute amount of wildly wealthy, which is happening at a rapid pace right now, we need to think outside the box, or you think inside the box, think in some sort of box, I don't know. And that's what this is meant to be doing, to get you to understand how an apodictic proof actually works. So whether or not people have gone to the moon or not, do you believe that there are people that are being blown up right now on some other place on the planet? Or that, climate change exists? Or that you're, like, really, you could lift a rock, find like a zillion examples of how apodictic proof is put to use in the most amazingly bizarre ways, none of which are very helpful. Mattia.
I was actually thinking about this yesterday for some reason. And I absolutely feel in tune with what you're saying. Since what I'm trying to do with the research is to get to the point where the question, asking if something is true or false is not the question to be asked, but truth as in cohesion, as in the logic of things, is the fundamental point. And I want this to put the two things aside because they don't decide to separate them. Because true or false, that is what I was thinking yesterday, that fascism needs mass communication. It did not exist before mass communication, because it's exactly the example you were making of many things. It wouldn't work if I have to tell Dane, as Oscar, tells Andrea, and because it wouldn't get lost. It needs to work on everybody at the same time. And there have been examples. One was, although wasn't certainly there to upset the system, the Black Swan book was trying to resist or to offer this trick to resist to defend oneself from possible risks by breaking down the big system and reverting to earlier, more local, more protected, more manageable situations of economics or society, which is what has been seen recently. They say the problem of interconnectivity has been seen as the greatest risk the world has, because any problem that starts somewhere spreads way too fast. But these links with Mark's concern, how then we are down to the fact that we can only just answer your statement, I have not job yet, which yes you did. And then you say, no I didn't, yes you did. But then next step is just, well, hate each other. If we
That's right.
if we remain on that level of
Yeah.
two opposite statements.
Well, I mean, this is an old Socratic position that was brought up with Socrates versus Themistocus. You know, might is right, who shouts longer, or, you know, the old famous thing, the one with the most toys wins. You know, it's the same argument. And is it that I just shout louder, or I just bring in an army and shoot you, and therefore it will be yes? Or you just do the same thing and it will be no? We're back to the binaric zero-sum game. I mean, again, the first law of all political science is there are always leaders in lead. And the caveat to that is, and if there aren't, then you make it happen.
This is what I was saying. I have a very, very hard time outside artistic sense envisioning or intuiting a logic that doesn't, one way or another, lead me back to
A binary.
A binary, yes. I wish to be able to think that. I can only think it for semantics and aesthetics, not for politics.
But the thing is that, and here's where people like Herbert Marcuse, M-A-R-C-U-S-E, and the whole Frankfurt School, but coming out of the Marcusean move, really put their money on art and artist. Because the argument was, and still is, that for reasons that you can make either an analysis or you just say that's the situation, artists, for whatever reasons, will think outside the box. And therefore, at least at a minimum level, you can trust that group to not toe the party line. Of course, as it turns out, the more that you get down that road, the more you realize that's not the case. And in fact, our good friend Daniel Rubenstein, he just put on the MA photography show at Central St. Martin's. There was a pre-show. I don't know if anybody's talked to Daniel about this. There was a pre-show before the show where they only allowed the oligarchs in, and wives of oligarchs and husbands of oligarchs to come in and buy the artwork before they opened the MA show to the public. And they bought over £1 million worth of art. And then it was announced on the opening of the show, this has been a very successful show. Of course, the show had just opened. This has been a very successful show because X amount of pounds of art has been bought. Now, can you imagine if we did that with our MA show? That we had a bunch of oligarchs come in and buy your work. You know, the good news, the bad news, same news. Now, we don't do that. Now, that we don't do that, does that mean that this school is marked for closure? Because there ain't nothing like money to make the world go round. I feel like launching into the cabaret song. You know, and so that's just very sobering when you think that. And you think, wow, you know, do you do your artwork in order for these oligarchs to come in and buy your work, to collect it, to put it in bank vaults, or wherever they're going to put them, because they're not necessarily going to put them in their various homes. So you see, so even if you put your money on the artist leading the revolution, that's not always going to work either. So the question then becomes, how do you literally make a difference, or make difference, or whatever the thing is? And here's where Kant sort of does come to his own with the radical autonomy of the individual. And that's what's sort of collected into, we'll see when we get to the critique of judgment, how that operates. But it's a problem. Because, you know, the Marcusians ran into a brick wall, the people, you know, this tide of meanness, I don't get why it's happening, but it is happening. And it's happening on a massive scale.
I saw it in Grace's paper that she gave was it last week.
The meanness of Grace.
The way illusion forms misogyny. That was what I got from your paper.
Aren't you glad about that, Grace?
The dominant performative discourse that Judith Butler writes about, but she's talking about it in terms of gender. But it's just when ideology can make sort of physicality jump to do what it says, like which is what you were trying to do by telling us you haven't dropped the apple. And so it seems to me that I don't know if Kant is talking about performative discourses. I really haven't got my head around Kant, but it seems to me that the thing art has to do is to subvert dominant performative discourses, to sort of make things more embodied.
But art, when he was talking about, just to be fair to Kant on this level, he really wasn't talking about performance art.
No, no.
The idea of performance and art in the
Discourse.
same sentence was just anathema.
He's talking about modes of things rather than things themselves, isn't he?
Yes, and they become art in this way in which one understands that it is a mode, it is a process.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how Grace's thing generated the message. Can you just explain that message a bit?
Well, what I took from it was that women were sort of, it was a pretty much a kind of the logic of the Holocaust in a way. There's too many of these bloody women. We wish we could just, do
Get rid
away
of
with
them,
them. And so we'll enact our fantasy by creating these, nice little illusions that make them vanish, while at the same time we're sending them off to the colonies and, like that was what I took from it. But illusion and dominant discourse have something really interesting in common.
And yet it's not always about a conjuring act. Political, yeah.
It's as well that
So people didn't go on the moon.
Wants to believe.
That people went on the moon. And
yes, people wants to believe that he was on the moon because of the circumstances, or because they want to communicate through after death. Or there is something very important on knowing what people want to be able to communicate in that way.
Yes, but be very careful
Is it
there.
a fantasy or not?
But here's where you keep remembering your computer. Computer's your friend, in the sense that is what, let's say the computer is, just for the sake of this, and please forgive me, Emmanuel. Anyway, just pretend at the moment that the computer is intuition. It's not your opinion that is intuition. It's the hardware that's the intuition. You'll be safe if you get that part, because then you won't fall into the trap of thinking, I think this, you think that. The intuition in Kant is a very different animal. It's much more hardwired than it is meant to be an opinion of how something's working. It's really so when I said things are political, I didn't necessarily mean ideological. I meant political as a very separate, as a creative force that can make something happen.
Social, did you mean?
No, I meant political. I meant political in the sense that it creates a movement that embodies both an ethical position and at the same time it presents a position. It creates a position. And so the move that Derrida makes is to present things as undecidable. At the origin is undecidable. The move that like, let's say, Leclerc and the people that started the post-structuralist move, was to put politics as the center feature. They both drew their sort of arguments from Kant and Hegel. And it's kind of an interesting scenario, how you could get very different DNA out of that position. Is the political at the origin? Is the political the groundless ground? Well, for Kant, he's going to say it's the transcendental, but is the transcendental actually the political, et cetera, et cetera. So you go in this kind of,
Because the transcendental, I would almost say, it is a form of groundless ground, but a groundless ground is a form of transcendental.
Yes.
Yet when we were reading Leibniz, it all seemed very contingent until the last asymptotic point, where it would be touching God's decision, race, that would have wrapped it all up. But that moment, or that ground of God, original and final decision, had been interpreted interpreted by Chaitin, whom we also read, as an initial degree of complexity so that there is enough roughness for things to have grasp upon each other and so they can move without just sliding off to infinity without ever living together. And I wonder, and literally I wonder, this genuinely is not rhetoric, if it is necessary to find the origin, and we cannot have different flames in different times and relate to those.
Absolutely, and that's hopefully where we're moving well, A, in the PhD seminar, but B, I think that the importance of looking at physics, particularly the Einsteinian moves, is precisely that.
Can you say that again so we can hear that?
That
That's really important.
with the bit of the origin and the flame, so
Yeah.
that the groundless ground to me is one version of transcendental, something that functions as if it be grounded on absolute logic, but is nowhere else. It only functions here. It's not in the evidence. When before Kant we were reading Leibniz, all the connections and lines of causality dictated by the monad seemed somehow contingent because they were based on possibilities of finding ways of being together and excluding non-possible or non-compossible options. So they were falling by the way and being left out or diverging into other universes that is what we're saying. However, Leibniz puts, although these contingency becomes narrow, it seems to be free, but in the end it always meets with God, choice, infinite wisdom and infinite grace as the origin, the original cause and the final cause, which then wraps it up, gives it boundary and brings it back to the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So these two moves do
but
not...
it doesn't give it a boundary. He says
No, it's not a visual boundary.
It's boundless. He's claiming that it's like boundless.
Yes,
so
but there's
even though he says it's God, it's not bounded. It's that's why it's
not that God is bounded, but the fact that God
it's
ambiguous. I think I agree.
Like about the impossibility of then like as if like there's a God with it's like as if the God's got this sort of wider eye view or something, but it's not a cup like closed. God's
No, it's
eye
not.
view is
No,
the
no.
cup, it's
It
boundless.
is the smallest
So
or the
boundless
most
is
infinitesimal
overtaken.
cup ever. I agree. But at the same time, there is Leibniz doesn't rid us entirely of the problem of origin and telos. It's still there. Somehow we are hinging it asymptotically on it. It's not. No, we're not free from it. And by not being free from it, we can just fall back in it full time. What Chaitin says of in a passing moment of a lecture he gives on complexity on paragraph 6 of the Treatise of Metaphysics, he says that Leibniz uses God as an initial degree of complexity so that there can be enough roughness, enough folds, enough pattern, whatever we want to call it, so that the next movement has something to grab upon and hold it. Because if there would be no complexity, everything would be completely smooth, then nothing would happen. No. All the particles would forever fall to infinity without ever holding together and creating it.
So it seems to me, if I could just go back to what Mark was actually going to say, you remember the early dicta that Kant, or actually it was David Ricardo, puts out regarding the Enlightenment. Supposing it could be otherwise, the as if, supposing it could be otherwise, what does your otherwise look like? This supposing that is this transcendental. That's what's being put down as the way in which you can develop a logic. So supposing you want to go through the door, supposing you want to escape fascism, supposing you want, supposing it could be otherwise, what's the trajectory? Now the trajectory is not going to be necessarily a straight line. It's it's not necessarily going to be. Let's say we all know from but a lot of people would understand what the term ducking and diving means in this city or in this country even. I don't know if it would be as understandable in the States, but if you said, I know ducking and diving, it means that there are rules of the game which you're not allowed to play, and so in order to play the game, you need to know how to do the sort of back game to the game. So supposing it could be otherwise, you need to know the back alleys, as it were, so you can get to where it is you want to go, wherever that is. Of course, you don't know where you want to go, because it's not telos. So the transcendental groundless ground is the supposing that it could be otherwise that unfolds a series of possibilities around which if you go that way, these 75 things happen. If you go this way, that can happen. And you end up learning how to base your supposing it could be otherwise transcendental move on probability. And that's as far as the Kantian move will take you. It takes you to probability. It takes you to certainty. It doesn't take you to complexity. Not yet, not really.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go back to Leibniz to start the complexity ball rolling on the same supposing that it could be otherwise. That's what I heard you to say.
Yes, but also the supposing that can be otherwise can be there can be many otherwise, not only in the future as you know from now, but in this way or that way. We don't have to stick to the previous one either.
That's right.
So that I believe that this is what Mark wanted me to repeat. That there are moments where, because that's actually in Leibniz, the whole sequence or serialization of things develops consequentially for a while, and then something intervenes and tilts the system completely or massively, so that there is a new beginning, and then a new one. So those are conceptual frames or logical frames that we use.
Yes, I mean, and a book that is useful to look at, actually, believe it or not, which is a very popular book, is a popular written book, is called The Tipping Point. I don't know if anybody's ever come across this. And in The Tipping Point, which is basically a book for business students, to give you a sense of, you know, when something changes, then you can tell, and how do you know when it just sort of goes over? What's the going over side? On a sort of meta-philosophical level, you start getting into this tipping point type of thing. But all resistance movements are based on the tipping point.
Yes, absolutely. But the other side of this, if the frame are not just tipping points in terms of systems that reach critical stages and then change, but one does not have one origin to always go back to, or one telos, but one of many. That's precisely the decision that the artist makes when one decides, well, this piece or my artwork starts with all these things, and I decided beyond this line that I have not decided that I choose to draw, it's reality, and on this side of this line is art.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very important for the way we work now, because since there is no longer discipline, a discipline to follow, or
a canon,
or a technique in terms of a discipline to follow. What makes art is a decision that we take to decide, well, this is now art.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only because Duchamp started with the famous urinal, but it has endless variations. And even within the work, where do you set the boundary or the limit of, I decided this is transparent and I see through it several other elements. And instead this is opaque. This I take is in the late terms and is right at the front. So setting these frames is in continuous move and is aesthetic and obviously and political at the same time.
Good. Okay. Can we take a break? Can we make this as a breaking point? Because Christine Wertheim is now here, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought, because you're going to need some time to re-gun your, thing or things. But may I suggest that next week, if it's okay, that you concentrate on the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals? Or it depends, because what's going to happen in this book is that you get to see the role of how the will operates. And I think that will help. I feel like we're just, we're almost ready. Hello. 1 second. Come in.
Should we go away?
No, don't go away, come in. That what would be nice is to connect this with the way in which the transcendental is operating. And then we will continue to, and then we will go on to the last session on the critique of judgment. Is that okay? Good. So take a little break, and then we'll start at 5 so that we can.
Is there a translation?
The one that I'm using is the I think this is the H.J. Patton framework of the metaphysics of morals. It's mainly on the categorical imperatives that you can look at.